Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last session of the day, the parallel session on Beyond Net Zero Multidisciplinary Approaches. I'll be moderating this session. My name is Devrim Yilmaz. I'm a senior economist at the Macroeconomic modeling team, JAM. And we're going to have 3 presentations today. First presentation, 2 of them will be online. And Victor here is going to be presenting in person. We also have 2 colleagues of Patrice Ebah. Patrice will be presenting online. But Alfonso and Fabrice are here, both of them, and they will be answering any questions from the room or online. And each of you will have 20 minutes, as always. And I'll try to stick to the time because it's already getting late. And so we're going to start with Adrien Vogt Schilb. Adrien, yeah, he's there. I think he can hear us, hopefully.
Hello, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yeah. And Adrien is a senior economist at the Chilean Inter-American Development Bank, and he will be presenting their paper on achieving net zero prosperity, how governments can unlock 15 essential transformations. And this is a comprehensive study of barriers to decarbonization and social, political, or economical, and how governments can create policies to eliminate these barriers. So we're going to start with Adrien, and then Victor is going to present his paper. Victor is a researcher at Ecole des Mines de Paris, France, and he's going to be presenting his paper on transition of the European power systems within planetary boundaries, which is an energy model. Yeah, yeah. It's the E times EU model, if I'm not wrong. And then Patrice Ebah will be presenting the last session. Patrice is the coordinator of AMR 2D framework at IRD, IRD, I guess in French, so I say it correctly. And he's going to be talking, he's going to be presenting his paper, The Law as a Lever to Respond to the Issue of Responsible Mining in West Africa. And he's going to be talking about the experiences of Côte d'Ivoire, Niger and Guinea. Yeah. So I'm going to give the floor to Adrien, if you're ready, Adrien. And you have 20 minutes, so you can start.
I am ready. Can you just confirm that you are currently seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
Hearing me?
Yes, all is good.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for the French Development Agency for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wish I could be in person in Paris, but presenting online is also great. So as you said, my name is Adrien Vogt Schilb. I am a senior economist in the climate change division of the Inter-American Development Bank. We are like a World Bank or a French development agency that only focuses on Latin America and the Caribbean. And part of my job is to produce the knowledge that the governments in the region need to face the climate crisis. And within that context, we've issued in July this publication called Achieving Net Zero Prosperity, How Governments Can Unlock 15 Essential Transformations. The publication is available in English, in Spanish, and in French, which may be of interest for many of you. You can download it from this link or QR code. And today, basically, I want to leave you with 3 main messages. The first one is that by now, I think we understand going to net zero emission, it's necessary, it's also doable, and it's not an economic sacrifice. It comes with a lot of benefits. But the problem is that it requires many people to take action, and these people face a lot of barriers and don't necessarily know how to reduce emissions. So in this publication, what we do is to present 15 known technology and behavior changes that taken together would allow most countries to get to almost net zero emissions by 2050 and show how governments can enable this transition. And the key finding is that getting to net zero emission is going to be complex. It's going to require actions from a lot of parts of the government, and it cannot be solved, you know, with just the Ministry of Environment or just the Ministry of Finance using one silver bullet policy. So first of all, I said it's not a sacrifice, right? Actually, we think getting to net zero emission is a huge economic opportunity. The most important reason is that renewable energy, in particular solar and wind, the cost of these technologies has been reduced by more than 90% in the last decade. And today, solar and wind are the cheapest sources of energy that have ever been available to mankind. Right? That's the reason why globally, more than 90% of electric generation capacity addition for the last 3 years have been renewable energy. The same thing is happening to batteries. The cost is dropping. Batteries is a key part of the cost of electric mobility. It's also important for things like enabling the management of a grid that contains a lot of intermittent solar and wind. So electric vehicles are also in the uptake. It's already more than 15% of vehicles sold globally that are electric vehicles. And the transition comes with many other benefits. For instance, air pollution. You know, in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's very common that countries lose about 3% of their GDP every year because of the health impacts of air pollution. So addressing the transition to net zero emission can allow to reduce a little bit this cost. And another one that's less known, but I think as or maybe more important, is congestion. People lose a lot of time in congestion, and time is money. We also have studies that show 3% of GDP is common as the cost of congestion for cities in Latin America and the Caribbean. So if you address a better, if you address this problem by during the transition to net zero emission, that's a lot of potential that you can also make. And preserving ecosystem services and biodiversity, for instance, is another kind of benefits that also can enable countries to continue to attract tourism revenues. In total, we think that by 2030, the countries that transition to net zero emission can get more than 1% additional growth, and also at the regional level, 15 million net new jobs can be created. But again, all these benefits doesn't mean that it's easy. It's actually super challenging. We have this study from almost a year ago that shows that to transition to net zero emission, we and a resilient economy, we need the equivalent of 20% of GDP of spending every year aligned with climate change goals in the region. That's up to $800 billion every year. It doesn't mean an additional cost. You know, I already told you in net, this is a net benefit, but it means that so many people, when they decide what to buy, where to invest, they have to take into account climate change goals. Just to put this number in perspective, if the countries in the region were to entirely remove fossil fuel subsidies and instead put a tax on carbon and on the local pollution, they would still only have 1/3 of those $800 billion per year. And what it means is that getting to net zero emission is not about spending more money and getting more money. It's mainly about redirecting existing spending towards net zero solution. And the challenge of doing that is that climate change plans are typically designed by the Ministry of Environment. But I just told you what you need is households and firms and government agencies in all the sectors, you know, in the transport sector, in the energy sector, in the agriculture sector, to take into account climate change and emission reduction goals when they spend money. But these actors usually have other goals than reducing emissions and limited knowledge on how they can do it. So to solve this issue, what this paper does is to list 15 transformations that we already know is technologies that are already known and behaviors that are already understood that would allow countries to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And then to explain to these non-environmental actors what they should care, we list the benefits associated with those transformations. And then once you've established, you know, that there's a clear solution and that they have benefits, why is it not happening? Because there are barriers. So we try to list those barriers. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. And once you understand the barriers, there's a direct link with what kind of interventions can government use to remove the barriers and therefore enable a transition to a net zero economy. And again, you know, the result is a paper that debunks this idea that carbon pricing or just involving the Ministry of Finance is the silver bullet that's going to solve decarbonization, and that instead gives you a menu of options for all 9 ministries and all levels of governments, including municipal, regional, federal, to consider to design their own roadmaps of policy interventions to enable a net zero economy. So let me give you actually my favorite example of barriers to spending in the net zero economy. It's the case of electric buses, right? So electric buses, of course, they are essential to reduce congestion, to reduce air pollution, and they can actually be cheaper over the 10 or 12 years that you're gonna keep them than diesel alternatives, right? Because they consume much less energy. And they're also much cheaper to maintain because electric buses are inherently much simpler than diesel buses. Now, in Chile, there was an issue. The Ministry of Transport mandated that bus drivers have to own their bus. But the bus drivers, they couldn't get the money to buy the buses because even though over 10 years it's cheaper, just buying the bus is super expensive. It can be 2-3 years of revenues. So the bankers were like, no, this is way too risky. I cannot lend you money for doing that. And the solution they came with was to change the regulations of the Ministry of Transport, to split the market for bus ownership in the one hand and bus operation in the other hand. And now any company can buy buses. In particular, big energy companies like Engie and Enel, they used to build power plants. So for them, buying a bus is pocket money. So they can just buy the bus. They don't need to convince bankers or borrow. And then they lease them to the bus drivers. And so the bus drivers now, instead of having a problem with the money for the bus, they have a solution. They have Engie or Enel telling them, look, this is an easy risk-free lease, $200 exactly every month. You don't have to worry about the technology or the maintenance. And today, Santiago has the biggest fleet of electric vehicles around the world outside of China. And I really, really like this example because it shows how regulations from a ministry, not the environment ministry, not the Ministry of Finance, not a carbon tax, changing the regulations suddenly allows a big part of the private sector, in this case, Engie and Enel, to fund solutions for another part of the private sector, in this case, the bus drivers. So I think that demystifies a little bit what it means to finance the transition and to get the private sector involved. Now, the regulation is just one example of one problem, right? Another problem that you can have is, and that a lot of countries in the region have, is inadequate infrastructure, right? If you don't have specific bus lanes, if you don't have great bike lanes, sometimes the countries don't even have sidewalks for people to walk. Then, of course, even if congestion is a problem, even if air pollution is a problem, even if electric bus drivers have buses and it will make more sense, people are going to prefer the car. So it's not just the regulations, you also need the infrastructure. And it's not just the transport sector. I'm giving you the example of the transport sector. But for instance, now I live in Chile. In Chile, there is a lot of wind in the south and a lot of sun in the north, but people live in the center of the country. And if you don't have the transmission lines to bring electricity, renewable electricity generated at the extremes of the country to the middle, then you're not going to have a lot of renewable energy in your country. So I gave you examples of infrastructure and regulations, but we have so many more barriers listed in the book. So the approach we took is to first start by understanding what it is that we want to see changing in the ground. I gave you electric buses as an example and renewable energy as another example, but we wanted to have a systematic view. So we started from the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean. You see here that greenhouse gas emissions in the region, they come from fossil fuels for electricity generation, for transportation, mainly by car, for deforestation, and deforestation itself mainly comes from beef production. I don't know if you know, 80% of the land used globally for food production is for beef. So beef is taking all the space, and that space comes from deforestation. Agriculture and the use of fertilizers, and then fossil fuel use in buildings, in industry, and waste management, basically. So from a full diagnostic of where emissions come from, you can build a list of transformations. That is, technology changes and behavioral changes that are known today. You find those in the literature, no problem, to remove those emissions, right? Things like renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. Electric vehicles, but mainly bus, walking, and biking instead of car dependency. More balanced diets that use much less beef, therefore giving a lot of room for ecosystem preservation, biodiversity preservation. Changing farming practices, maybe to put trees on the top of of crop responsible and reducing the use of fertilizers. Electrifying buildings, electric cook stove, electric heat pumps for heating, insulated building, also electrifying industry, recycling, composting, changing materials a little bit, and green hydrogen for a few industrial processes maybe in the future. This is a picture of the transformations that all the countries can consider to get to net zero emissions. In the book, it looks like this, that's the table of content. We just systematically go through the main sectors, electricity, transport, agriculture, buildings, industry, waste, and list the transformations similar to what the example I just given you. And what we do for each one of those transformations is first start about why should the private sectors care? Why should the line ministries care? In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is not realistically going to be the #1 priority. And I already gave you a lot of examples of the benefits, right? Financial savings is the most important one. Renewable energy is already the cheapest option. Electric vehicle is very soon becoming the cheapest option for most users. Other benefits such as public health, productivity. I gave you the example of air pollution, accidents I didn't mention. If people take the bus instead of the car, there's going to be less accidents. The time loss in congestion is huge. Other environmental benefits, such as water pollution, for instance, or soil pollution related to fertilizer use today, you can reduce that. And other economic benefits, such as creating jobs, creating growth, etc. So again, if we know the transformation, the techniques, and the behavior changes that bring us to net zero emissions, and they come with benefits, why are they not happening? They're not happening because the barriers will also list them. I gave you the example of the regulation in the transport sector that prevented electric buses. You also have regulations that prevent cities to build dense neighborhoods. The regulations mandate that you have to build sprawl with individual houses only their own car, for instance. You have regulations that make it impossible to get a permit to use land for renewable energy production or to connect to the grid. Infrastructure, I gave you the example of the bus lanes, of the sidewalks, the transmission lines for electricity generation. Sometimes high upfront costs, again, like the electric vehicles, but that's also the case for insulating buildings, for instance. Lack of capacity and information. Most people don't know that air conditioning can be used to heat spaces 4 times more efficiently and 4 times more cheaply, sorry, that's not a word, than using fossil fuels or electric heating. Or most people don't know that if they want to reduce the carbon impact of their diet, then reducing beef is the single most important thing they can do. Fiscal impacts. A lot of countries use gasoline taxes to fund the government, or royalties on fossil fuel production. If you want to phase those out, you need a plan to address the fiscal impacts. And distributional impacts, for instance, in a study we did, we found that in Chile, 4,000 people work in coal power plants. In some cities, it's 8% of the workforce who works on the local coal power plant. If you want to phase out coal power plants, you're going to need a plan for that. And once you have these barriers listed, the solutions, the government interventions to enable the transition are very straightforward. If the problem is regulations, update the regulations. If the problem is infrastructure, build infrastructure. If the problem is capacity, build capacity, provide information. If the problem is the fiscal impact, do fiscal reforms, find other sources of revenues. And if the problem is distributional impacts, build policy packages to ensure just transition and minimize losses and compensate losses. And I'm not saying these government interventions are easy or that they are automatic to do. I'm just saying this is what the governments should be looking at. And again, debunking this idea that the solution is to put a carbon price. Carbon price might maybe help with one of the barriers in a few sectors, but you still have all the other barriers that the line ministries, sometimes the municipal governments, have to tackle. And it's important that they understand, what the goals are, the transformations, what the problems are, and what the solutions to these problems are. And in the last 3 minutes, I just want to give you an example of how Costa Rica inspired this with the decarbonization plan, basically, right? So we helped them with a study that showed, this is classic. If you don't do anything and you continue to develop with current trends, emissions are going to increase over time. But they have a thing called the National Decarbonization Plan that they issued in 2019 that gives you a list of transformation that makes sense at the sector level. More electric buses, more reforestation. You know, you're not talking about reducing greenhouse gases with the sector people, just about specific transformation. And you can quantify the impact of these transformations on emissions and double check that they will allow you to reach the net zero emission goal by 2050, which is the goal that the country has. But then why the sectors should do that? Because of the benefits. So in this study, we quantified the cost and the benefits of getting to net zero in Costa Rica. In orange here, you can see the investment needed in the electric buses, also in insulating the buildings, in building more grids for renewable energy. But then in dark blue, you see the benefits of not having to use fossil fuels and the fact that these technologies are already cheaper now, electric vehicles and renewable energy. And then in light blue, you see our quantification of the other kinds of benefits that I mentioned: reduced congestion, reduced accidents, better health, etc. In gray, you see ecosystem services like tourism revenues for Costa Rica that more than offset the land that's the value of land that you don't use for food production anymore because you reforest it. And in yellow, you see the value of saved materials if you implement recycling and circular economy practices in the country. And again, the fact that it has a net benefit overall doesn't mean that it's going to happen autonomously, because there are barriers that prevent the private sector to invest in those solutions, even if they have net benefits. And the plan of Costa Rica understands those barriers. I'll give you just two examples. Because they have this goal of getting a lot of electric buses in the future. And they understand the way the regulations, exactly like in Chile, are currently built. They prevent the private sector to buy those electric vehicles. So they say we need to change the regulations for bus concession to make it easy for the private sector to make money with electric vehicles. Similarly, they want to reforest. And for that, they need to figure out a way to paying farmers to reforest instead of producing food. And so they came with this plan, the National Decarbonization Plan that I mentioned, that really has 70 policy measures like this that say we need to implement all of these to enable the transition to net zero emission. And the last thing I wanted to tell you is these plans, they can allow you to raise money on the international markets. For instance, the IDB with the French Development Agency and other development banks, we lent almost $1 billion to the Ministry of Finance of Costa Rica on the condition that he would ensure that those policy interventions that remove those barriers to getting to net zero emissions would be implemented. And the IMF, for instance, also recognized the importance at the macroeconomic level for the country to transition to net zero emissions because they understand that there is more benefits than cost in doing so. So that's just an example of how the countries can be successful in our hope in using this book, right? Again, it's available in your language, maybe. And the main message is we know it's doable. We know it brings benefits to get to net zero emissions, but there are barriers. And so what you need to do is understand the specific transformations that get you to net zero emissions, understand the barriers to this specific intervention, and then ask the government agencies to remove those very specific barriers, like the regulations that tell you what kind of buses you can use in the country, and not just claim that a carbon price, for instance, would solve it. Thank you so much. I hope you have questions. I'm ready to answer them.
Thank you very much, Adrien. We're going to get to questions after the presentation, so if you stay with us, great. I'm sure there will be questions. I'll have one at least. So. And our next presenter is Victor Guillot, and as I've said, Victor is a researcher at Ecole des Mines de Paris, France, and he's going to present his paper on transition of the European power system within planetary boundaries. As I've said, this is an energy model. It's the E times EU model, and Victor's paper actually focuses on this model within the context of planetary boundaries and completely greening the European electricity system until 2050. The floor is yours, Victor.
All right, thank you. So in this presentation, I will talk about how we can actually use the planetary boundaries framework to design the transition of the European power system. So I don't know, you may not be familiar with energy system models, but the idea here, it's, I won't go in depth, go into details of the model, but I will just use it as an illustration of how we can actually use the planetary boundary framework to improve our practices. So today's parallel session topic is Beyond Net Zero, multidisciplinary approach. So let's start with the net zero and carbon neutrality concept and see what are the limits associated with this notion. So first, carbon neutrality was meant to tackle this question of global warming, so it solely focus on greenhouse gas emission. But because it's only related to greenhouse gas emission, of course it overlooks other aspects such as water consumption, or land use, or other biogeochemical flows. So first point on that is that it neglects other environmental impacts. Second, net zero, it fixes an objective in 2050, 2060, but it doesn't say much on the trajectory. And when you think in terms of global warming, it's better to think in terms of carbon budget or carbon quotas. So this is another limit of using the concept of net zero. Last, on that point, it doesn't say much on social aspects. It's because it's mainly focuses on greenhouse gas. It neglects social aspects, which are quite important when you are developing energy systems or infrastructures, because the implementation of the field, you can have problem, let's say, related to a lack of social acceptance, and it may slow down the whole process and actually endanger the carbon neutrality objective that you have. So this brings me to the two research questions that has been used to conduct these studies and also to structure this presentation. So first, the first question we asked was how sustainable is the carbon neutrality scenario of the transition of the European power system? And second, the second point was to identify the way to reduce the environmental impacts, and what are the challenges related to the implementation of this decarbonization. So let's start with a short review of the notion that I will use. First, there is planetary boundaries and their operationalization. The idea why it is interesting to use the planetary boundary framework is that it covers multiple environmental impacts, and you can actually use it to assess the sustainability of either a country or a sector of the economy. So very powerful tool, and you start to find guidelines and method on how to actually use this framework. So that was for operationalization of planetary boundary, but we also have at hand energy system models that have been used for decades. It's a quantitative approach with proven quality for decision support, so it has been used for many years. And what we see right now is that it doesn't say much on environmental impact except for a greenhouse gas. If I rephrase, over the last 10 years, what we see is that most of the studies solely consider greenhouse gas emission and more specifically carbon dioxide. But usually environmental assessment is limited to post-process calculation or monetization of environmental impacts, which is a problem when you want to do a strong sustainability assessment. So the idea here is to actually bridge those two disciplines. So on one side, planetary boundaries, and on the other side, energy systems, and look on how we can use those two tools to do some strong sustainability assessment. So it has been done already a couple of times. Few examples, we find the US power system or the hydrogen road transport in the UK. So just to mention that it is still at an early stage, and it's quite a new approach to consider environmental impacts. So now a few words on the methodology. So unfortunately, you don't see the picture here, but it doesn't matter. The idea behind the model that we use is that it minimizes the total discounted cost, which is a sum of investment, operational cost, and fuel cost. The model can make decisions in order to minimize the total cost of the system, given that it respects all technical constraints that are linked to electricity production. The model we used covers most of the European Union countries plus a few other countries. And the novelty of that model is that trade of electricity is allowed, so we can look into cooperation and how the burden look into question like effort sharing of environmental impacts. To conclude on that slide, I want to give a few words on the illustration. On the bottom left-hand side, you have here a simplified representation of the model for two technologies, and you have on the left the input. So basically, there are fuel and bulk materials, so aluminum, concrete, copper, and steel. And on the right-hand side, you have all the output. So, of course, electricity, but also the environmental impacts that are greenhouse gas, land, so land occupation, biogeochemical flows that are nitrogen flows and phosphorus flows. And lastly, we put water consumption. So that was for the model. Now, let's dive into the results and what we can actually do. And the first objective of this study was to assess the sustainability of a carbon neutrality scenario. So here, left-hand side, just to give you a taste of what the results look like, you have the production at the European level of electricity between 2016 and 2050. And what you can see is that so there is a carbon neutrality constraint in this scenario. And what you can see is that this constraint forces the model to drastically reduce fossil-based technology that are in black and red, which are coal and natural gas-based technologies. So in order to get rid of all these fossil-based technologies, the model decide to replace them with mostly renewables that are wind and solar photovoltaics, solar PV. So that was for actually how we can reach carbon neutrality. Then on the right-hand side, if we look at what are the environmental impacts of this power mix, the first result, and which is encouraging, is that carbon neutrality goes into the right direction because it reduces most of the environmental impacts that you can see here. So there are both N and P flows and water consumption, actually it decreases over time, and it follows the same trend as carbon dioxide. So carbon neutrality goes into the right direction, and it's actually a good thing to do right now. But if we look more into details, what you can see is that it can actually downgrade some other indicators, such as land use. So you have here in red land use, and what you can see is that between 2045 and 2050, it actually increases. This is mainly related to biomass, biomass use linked to negative emission. And so what you do is that you use biomass with carbon capture and storage to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it actually, it downgrades land use indicators because it partially relies on energy crops. A few words on bulk material consumption. You have here for 4 materials, what you can see is that if you want to get rid of all the fossils, you will have to increase the use of materials. It almost doubles for concrete between 2016 and 2050, but it can be multiplied by 6 for aluminum, which is quite serious. So just to say that getting rid of fossils means also to dig for more raw materials. So once we have in mind all these insights linked to the carbon neutrality scenario, we can actually compare the performance and do some sustainability assessment using the planetary boundary framework. So what we did here is that we downscaled the value of the planetary boundary to the European power system. We chose 2 different allocation functions. One is based on added value creation, and the other is based on past greenhouse gas emission, which is which is usually called the grandfathering method. So on this graph, you have 2 lines which relates to the 2 allocation methods. And those 2 lines define what we call the safe operating space, and it's actually where we have to stay if we want to have a sustainable power system. So if we comment that graph, what you can see is that depending on the allocation rule, it's quite difficult to stay within the safe operating space, and especially for the one that is based on value added creation. Except for water and somehow nitrogen, phosphorus, land, and greenhouse gas are they actually overshoot multiple times the safe operating space, which is that means that staying within the safe operating space is a very difficult thing. We built different scenarios that, in addition to the neutrality scenarios, that actually reduce all the environmental impacts. And you have here what we call reduction with some percent. So that means that the reduction 50%, you will cut by half all the environmental impact. And what we see here, that even if we are cutting by half all the environmental impacts, it's still difficult to stay within a safe operating space. And I just want to highlight the fact that for greenhouse gas, we are much above the 2 limits. and it's mainly related to the fact that when you are thinking in terms of carbon budget, it's quite different than just thinking in terms of carbon neutrality. So I would like just to conclude and make few recommendations on this topic, and they are twofold. So first part, I would say that operationalization of the PB framework is quite promising way to do some sustainability assessment and to produce recommendation for policymakers. So if we recall the results we had, what we can say for the European power system is that carbon neutrality, thinking in terms of carbon neutrality is not sufficient, but actually it doesn't hurt and it goes into the right direction. Fossil fuel phase out should be a priority and it will improve most of the indicators. But you still have to pay attention to some other that can be downgraded by the transition, such as biomass. If you remember last slide, I was saying that it is quite difficult to stay within the safe operating space. It actually questions the amount of electricity we can produce in the future, and these are questions that need more work, if I can say so. So that was for recommendation of PB framework and how to use it. Here you have a method that is quite ready to use, and it's a very powerful tool. Conclusion that are addressed more to academics, if I can say so. The difficulty to stay within the planetary boundaries raises the question on how do we actually allocate the share of how do we allocate the share of the safe operating space to different sectors, and who will have the right to emit carbon dioxide and who will not, and so on. The same applies to other environmental impacts. So the idea behind that is to find a way that actually our energy system, our economy can fit into the safe operating space. And there are questions. There are questions that are related to. I don't know who did that. Okay, sectoral allocation. Then you have the question of territorialization. Here, the PB has been downscaled at the European scale. That means that countries were able to share environmental impacts. So, for instance, a country can produce and sell electricity to another, and that country won't actually pollute. So this raises question on how do we actually operationalize locally the planetary boundary framework, and this is also a question for academics. And lastly, on that point, yes, downscaling, there are lots of normative choices behind, and it's not easy for modelers to take decisions, so and to work with that. So these are the topics that should be further investigated. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. As I've said, we're going to take questions afterwards. So we're going to move on with our next presentation with Patrice Ebah. And as I've said, Patrice is the coordinator of AMR2D framework at ERD. And the paper that will be presented is the law as a lever to respond to the issue of responsible mining in West Africa, the experience of Côte d'Ivoire, Niger and Guinea. So Patrice, if you're with us, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you all for the attention. Our presentation is the law. We know law as a level to address the issue of responsible mining in West Africa, analysis of environmental and social concern, and the light of mining legislation in Ivory Coast, Niger and Guinea. This presentation will, it's the fact of me, Patrice, Fabrice Collin, Grégory Giraud, Alphonse Yao, and Paten Mambo. In introduction, you can say that with 5% of the global exploration budget, West Africa is the largest recipient of mineral exploration investment across the continent. Africa holds a considerable share of the world reserve. According to current geological knowledge, Africa hosts 40% of the world's gold resource and between 80 or 90 of the world non-chrome and platinum resource. According to a recent Bloomberg report, there are nearly 13 million electrified vehicles on the road today. These figures show how green and a transitional mineral of utmost importance nowadays. Mining is a global industry. After located in remote, ecological, sensitive, and underdevelopment area, including many indigenous territories and lands. When managed appropriately and inclusively, it can create jobs, foster innovation, and provide investment and infrastructure on a significant and long-term scale. But when poorly managed, it can also lead to environmental degradation, displacement, inequality, and increased conflict among other things. This reality makes it possible to question the relevance of the law and achieving responsible mining in West Africa generally, and Côte d'Ivoire, Niger, and Guinea especially. The methodological approach taking into account the analysis of legal texts, doctrinal, and report of wells and field practice allow us to answer this question at two levels. The table of content, the first part is analyzing, highlighting the integration of social environmental concern into mining legislation. The two part is analyzing revealing persistent problem and the consideration of social environmental concern and mining legislation. Each part is subdivided in two parts. In the first part, you will do, the first part is subdivided in two parts, environmental, now, please, and analyze the consideration of social environmental concern and mining law. You say that environmental and social impact assessment, HCSEA, and environmental and social management plan. It is the common law and cornerstone of the integration of social environmental consideration and mining. Environmental protection inevitably requires compliance with the precautionary and preventive principle, the corollary which is the ASEA. In view of its importance, Professor Maurice Canto stated that the impact assessment is certainly the most specific and undoubtedly the most original institution in environmental law. It is at the heart of sustainable development. This obligation, which is included in environmental legislation for all countries, is founded especially in the mining legislation of all the countries covered by our study. The procedure can be summarized as following One, the project identification. After identification of the project, preliminary screening if Asia is not necessary, if Asia is required. If ASA is required in recruitment of the firm and prepare the term of reference. After the preparation of the term of the reference, carrying out the study. There are 9 steps in this step. Background or justification for the study. After this, the presentation of the project and analysis of the policy, legal, and institutional framework. Presentation of the promoter who make the project and description of the project. After this step, it continues to description of the receiving environment, and analysis of the potential impact of the project and environment and social. And after you make analysis of alternative and mitigation measures, and lastly, environmental and social impact management plan and project summary. After this step, environmental and social decision or authorization. The project, this study can reject or approve it. If it's approved, the project implementation and monitoring thing. And no, the environmental and social impact assessment results in an environmental social management plan. It is a real tool for the social and environmental acceptability of the mining project. The environmental social mining plan contains the following essential elements: the implementation of mitigation programs, environmental monitoring, schedule, and cost of the program. If the ESPM is rigorous and accountable, they can give the indicator, be simple, be clearly being integrated into the decision-making process and do not be resource intensive. And the environmental and social management plan is very important for the country. It's not that the mining code requires that this plan be established prior to exploitation. Example, the Ivory Coast mining code formulates that this obligation following. The Asia must include a management plan. The Asia must include an environmental and social management plan, include a plan for the rehabilitation, offset, and estimate of the MOS. The analysis of the NCR and the ESPM. Let us now look over advanced and the environmental and social concern. One, the establishment of the local mining development fund and committee. It is a remarkable revolution. We say that in our legislation, mining legislation, the community development fund take root and become a inalienable principle. The management of this fund is entrusted to an internal body that take from a committee as the case in Ivory Coast and Niger, or a convention in the case of Guinea. The best practical example is that promoted by Ivory Coast, who create the local mining development committee. But however, the use of this fund has proven to be a major concern for this. Difficult in awarding contract, the lack of a standard local mining development plan, the absence of LDSCM audit, and the daily setting up remain major irresolved concern. Secondly, the environmental sanction reliability obligation and establishment of no mining zone. It is a major event. Concerning the environmental section, with regard to environmental section, there is an overall movement in the 4th generation mining code. Thus, the mining legislation of country concern plus the issue of environmental sanction at the head of the system of sanction. There can be administrative, the sanction can be administrative, civil, and criminal. Concerning the rehabilitation, it is the obligation, the most important element to emerge from the analysis of the mining code is the obligation to create a rehabilitation and closed fund, which is a financial reserve for the implementation of a rehabilitation plan or rehabilitation action plan. The mining, no mining zone, prohibited area, the mining legislation of the free country covered gave great importance to the reality, to those realities. 4 zones are identified in the legislation. And this, but Guinea legislation is the most comprehensive in this respect. There are closing zone, protected or prohibited zone, protection zone, and extended security zone. After the advancing, see now the preoccupation, the common concern, and the specific concern and the mining legislation. One common concern, one, inadequation and no compliance with the tests. The absence of a specific liability regime for swan mining and environmental officer in case of corruption, and the exercise of environmental and social monitoring activities. The lack of consideration of the amount and land availability for agriculture when carrying out the environmental social impact assessment. The country concerning mining is usually carried out an open area with high biodiversity. The destruction of vegetation cover become a prerequisite for mining and research. Secondly, the lack of the independent high administrative authority to control and regulate the application of social, environmental, and mining. The mining administration is both the technical and regulatory body in the field. In such a context, it is difficult for the mining administration to play its role efficiently. The dissociation of role and institution further become an imperative, if not a fundamental requirement in the fight against corruption and good governance. And specific concern, one, the lack of specific and clear legal framework for the rehabilitation and social economic development of sites after exploitation. The lack of national guidance for mine site reclamation at state level. The definition of exploration and exploitation work subject to the restoration obligation are elements whose absence corroborates our approach. The loss of vegetation cover and the pollution of water resource are deplorable damage. In view, it was fact the notion of rehabilitation development become important in the roads and land after mining, whether for agriculture or other purpose. 2, the voluntary nature of CRC, the lack of the decentralized one-stop shop for the artisanal and small-scale mining, and the no recovery of mining total compensation and resettlement. And this, the non-recognition of the principle of superposition of the mining total. The compensation system is solely based on the financial aspect. It is important that the compensation will be based on the economical aspect. The dispersion of method and procedure, as well as the difference in compensation scales for resettlement are the result of the absence of the general policy or national guide in this area. The determination of the constraints of the owner's reality before the compensation role must be taken into account more. The lack of a guide to CRC practice in the mining sector is this country. The establishment of a guide become a major requirement. And the lack of a dematerialized one-stop shop for artisanal and small-scale mining actor. Based on our analysis, it is important to make recommendation for a more responsible management of the mining related to environment to promote the establishment of legal framework for the redevelopment and rehabilitation of mining sites to serve as a guide for the restoration of mining sites. And necessary to implement environment principle at all stages of the mining project cycle, and to ensure food security and environmental and social impact assessment by identifying arable land and the impact assessment, defining the amount of arable land available for agricultural crop for food needs, and to promote a green tax on mining based on the releasing of carbon through the filling of free that act as carbon reservoir or sinks, and to establish independent administrative authority for mining as an adaptation of the administrative organization of the state and the distribution of competence between the state and local authority. And last, and for the environment, to strengthen the mining code with obligation to fund scientific mining research by establishing a scientific research fund of 1% of the annual turnover of mining company. Concerning social term, it is important that to institutionalize a fourth responsibility regime from the social responsibility of mining actor by making it mandatory beyond the corporate social responsibility. To ensure the principle of overlapping mining title with few skull exception for gemstones, and to implement a guide on compensation and resettlement of affected community at regional and national level. And next step, to tackle the blatant illegality of gemstone mining in different countries. Again, to legalize, define mineralized corridor for artisanal and scale mining and mining area, and to strengthen the resource devoted to legal research on mining law, and to promote decentralized on one-stop process for obtaining mining title and the artisanal and mining school in order to simplify the procedure and reduce the cost and delay of granting artisanal and semi-industrial or semi-mechanized mining authorization, and to encourage the development of innovation sustainable projects on closing set, and to operationalize the publication of mining convention for greater transparency. And last, it's important to promote mandatory external social audit every year to measure the impact of the mine on social dynamic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrice. And I'd like to thank all the presenters for strictly respecting the time requirements. Almost everybody finished exactly on time. So thanks a lot, everyone, for that. So now we're open to questions. And I guess if there's any questions from the room first, we can start. I don't want to start myself. I can, but I don't want to do that. So. Elan, yeah.
Yeah. Is it working? Are you? Yes, okay. Thank you very much for the three presentations. I think I would have a common question for all of you. We are in a strong sustainability approach, and we have talked a lot of CO2 emissions, of solution with innovations, and in mining we have seen that the social aspects were very important and maybe lagging behind. So I wanted to know how you were, taking into account the social construct that we have talking about earlier on in your approaches. And maybe I have a specific question for Patrice on the mining issues. I mean, the list of recommendations is really huge. And I'm wondering whether there is a true willingness of the authorities, or we can ask the question. And precisely in the context of where the social and the citizen and the civil society could have a push, what is really the state of the art and the situation in the three countries you have presented, and maybe the push that the civil society could have in making progress in this legislation. Thank you very much.
Yes, briefly, thank you. On the issue of BECCS, so bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, I think this is a really fundamentally important point that you made about energy systems models in general, that there is a land use implication of these technologies that also implicates biodiversity, of course. So if you're very reliant on this form of technology for achieving large amounts of carbon emissions reductions in projections 30, 40 years into the future, you're trading off against a margin of biodiversity loss. So I guess I'm just curious if you could elaborate on this issue in your model, and maybe quantitatively how important is the carbon emission reduction coming from BECCS? And just any comment on that would be welcome. Thank you.
I guess I'll let our presenters to first answer these questions, and I'd like to say that again we have two colleagues of Patrice also with us here. If you feel like answering the questions, please. So let's follow the order of presentation, not to create any confusions. So Adrien, if you would like to start.
Yes, thank you. Just on the whole sustainability question, right? Typically the three pillars of sustainability include environmental, economic, and social. But I've sometimes seen a definition also include institutional aspects. And I just wanted to emphasize, I think that's important, right? It's like for any of those plans, climate change plans, biodiversity plan, environment plan, to be implemented, they need to be realistic from an institutional and political perspective. And that's why I think it's super important, given that environmental issues are transversal, to include the decision makers from line ministries and from subnational governments into the decision process. So they should have clear tasks to do, because realistically it depends on them that we achieve our goals. And also they should have a key reason to want to do these changes other than just a top-down mandate. And so I think that's why it's important to understand, when we want to go to net zero emissions, what the benefits of the transition would be for other actors and how they can contribute to the transition. Then the social impacts in particular are important, right? I only mentioned them very quickly in my presentation and what was one of the possible barriers. The reason it's not emphasized in the publication is that we have another one. We published the year before, with the International Labour Organization that was looking at the social and in particular the labor impact of the transition to net zero emission. Right, I mentioned the 15 million net new jobs in one of my first slides. That's net, but really we find that it's like 18 million jobs could be created. I actually don't remember the number, but some jobs are created, some jobs are destroyed, and on net you have 15 million net new jobs, right? But same thing, you know, for the transition to be realistic politically and to be sustainable, it has to make sense from a social perspective. And that for government means, I think, three things. One is to diagnose what are going to be the downsides. For instance, people working in coal power plants are going to lose their jobs. Cities that depend on coal power plants are going to lose a lot of economic activity. And then try to minimize or compensate those losses. But then there's also two other parts of the just transition. One is to actually maximize the benefits. You know, if you say you could have good jobs in renewable energy, but you end up just importing solar panels from abroad and not creating local jobs in the installation and maintenance of solar panels in the roofs, for instance, then the benefits are not materializing. So it's important to actually make the benefits real for your people. And the third one, which is kind of an enabling condition, is to make sure that people who are going to be affected positively or negatively by the climate change policies are integrated into the decision-making processes, right? Giving a voice to all stakeholders. It's the most efficient way, really, to make sure that your process is going to understand what the negative impacts are and how to avoid them or minimize them, and understand what the positive parts could be and how to maximize. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrien. Victor? Not working?
Thank you. So on the first question and social impacts, we mostly focused on environmental impacts. The reason why is it's because energy models are not very well suited for integration of these social impacts. So you still have ways to consider them, but you will have to create your different type of scenarios. But having indicators, social impact indicators, it's not an easy thing to do, and we first prefer to only work on environmental impacts, but it's something that's important too. On BECS, so what I can say is that we did not we were not able to integrate biodiversity. As it has been said today, there is a problem of data availability. So what I can say for now is that we did not find any good way to integrate it, but I would be interested by knowing if you have some. And yes, you said about projections to 2050. Yeah, we mostly use life cycle analysis data. So yeah, the idea was not to give numbers, but more insights. And what could be a problem if we were doing somehow business as usual development, but the idea was here just to show this method more as a proof of concept more than giving data. So yes, but what we can say for now is that large-scale deployment of BECS should be considered carefully, I guess.
Thanks, Victor. And Patrice or Alphonse, would you like to? Should we first give it to Patrice, maybe? Or Patrice, you're with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Would you like to answer the question?
Hello? Hello?
Patrice, tu as compris les questions qui ont été posées? Do you understand the question?
Oui. No.
Bon, la première question, c'est en fait comment tu as construit, comment on construit en fait la participation en fait, des populations dans l'élaboration des règles que tu as montrées, qui existent déjà de plus en plus et qui sont à construire. Et la deuxième question, c'est, compte tenu de la difficulté de tout ce que tu as montré en termes de recommandations, qu'est-ce qui est pour toi est faisable et comment, en fait, les politiques publiques acceptent ou vont accepter, comment on va faire pour que, en fait, tout ce monde, les opérateurs privés, les opérateurs publics puissent accompagner cette trajectoire de mine responsable, on va dire, compte tenu de toutes les difficultés que tu as montrées et de tout ce qui reste à faire comme travail. Perhaps you can speak in French if you want. Parce que je pense que everybody is speaking French here, so it's okay. Maybe okay. Tu as entendu?
Oui,
après, on complétera avec Alphonse.
D'accord, ma connexion était un peu défaillante. Là, bon, je crois que ce serait plus facile de le dire aisément en français, mais je vais le faire en anglais.
Non, mais parle en français, mais parle doucement.
D'accord. Et donc là, relativement à tout ce qu'on a pu avancer sur les différentes procédures au niveau de l'étude d'impact, tout comme du plan de gestion environnementale et sociale, il faut dire que dans la pratique, aujourd'hui, on est arrivé à un niveau où la prise de conscience au niveau des populations à travers des ONG et même à travers les entreprises elles-mêmes qui sont implantées dans les différents pays, on assiste à une prise en compte en fait, des préoccupations des différentes populations dans la réalisation de ces études-là. Mais ça ne suffit pas naturellement, d'autant plus que ce consentement-là, comme on l'avait dit, ce consentement n'est pas libre, préalable, informé et éclairé. Et donc, ça cause toujours des dommages au cours de l'exploitation de l'activité minière, d'autant plus que certaines populations se retrouvent dans des situations où leur dédommagement prend beaucoup, se retrouvent confrontées à beaucoup de difficultés et même des populations qui refusent, par exemple, de quitter des territoires, comme c'est le cas peut-être, par exemple, en Guinée, où des populations, bien que relogées, ont estimé qu'elles n'avaient pas été associées à la prise de décision, à l'attribution de l'autorisation, du permis, par exemple, d'exploitation. Et donc, c'est pour ça qu'on disait que la question de la participation du public doit se faire en amont, pendant et en aval de l'activité minière. Et donc, ça, relativement à la deuxième question, si je peux partir directement là-dessus, la deuxième question, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, toutes ces recommandations qu'on formule, l'objectif, c'est de construire au fur et à mesure cette dynamique-là avec les différents États qui font partie aujourd'hui de cette étude-là. Et donc, à l'échelle déjà du réseau d'activités minières responsables et développement durable, ce qu'on a essayé de faire, c'est de créer un cadre de dialogue entre les différents acteurs de la chaîne minière, c'est-à-dire les industriels, l'administration minière, les scientifiques, ainsi que la société civile, pour qu'il y ait des dialogues permanents, pour comprendre que les tests qui sont déjà élaborés aujourd'hui doivent évoluer au regard de certaines sensibilités nouvelles qui se posent, notamment, comme on a vu souligner tout à l'heure, la question de la quantité de terres disponibles pour l'agriculture dans l'étude d'impact environnemental. Ce n'est pas une question qui est résolue. La question, par exemple, de l'activité minière à petite échelle, par exemple, surtout ce qui concerne les mines artisanales semi-industrielles, il est important d'évoluer vers cette formalisation réelle et de lever toute balise capable d'empêcher la formalisation de cette échelle de l'activité minière. Et donc, ce sont des choses qui sont quand même faisables. Et donc, pas mal de mouvements qui sont en cours dans ce sens-là pour aboutir à ça. Mais il faut que le dialogue se poursuive pour pouvoir atteindre ces objectifs que nous avons formulés dans les recommandations qui, naturellement, constituent en fait des objectifs à l'échelle du réseau. Merci bien.
Oui, ce que je peux ajouter, c'est qu'on est en train d'évoluer vers une espèce d'harmonisation au niveau de la sous-région ouest-africaine, disons des pratiques, mais également aussi des textes qui réglementent l'activité minière. Et ceci se fait sur la base des institutions sous-régionales, comme la CEDEAO, la communauté des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, qui organise des rencontres tous les 2 ans. Il y a également donc l'UMOA, l'Union monétaire ouest-africaine, qui donne des directives qui ont un impact économique. Et donc, tous ces pays s'en approprient. Mais il y a également une forte mobilité des populations dans la sous-région ouest-africaine, donc encouragée par les institutions régionales, mais aussi il y a des traditions ou des peuples qui se retrouvent de part et d'autre des frontières. Et puis, ce qui vient encore créer un lien, c'est la pratique de l'activité minière, donc artisanale et semi-industrielle. Donc, dans un contexte où les textes ont eu tendance à évoluer d'abord séparément par pays, dans les années donc d'avant l'indépendance, il y a eu donc des pratiques qui minimisaient ou qui négligeaient totalement l'aspect de la question environnementale et sociale. Et puis donc, pour un pays comme la Côte d'Ivoire qui a décidé de mettre ses mines en valeur à partir des années 93-95, il y a eu un nouveau code minier qui a été pris, un peu plus attractif et qui tenait principalement en compte l'aspect environnemental et très peu l'aspect social. Plus récemment, en 2014, il y a eu donc un nouveau code minier qui a associé plus de scientifiques et qui a pris un peu plus en compte donc, les aspects, donc, les questions environnementales et sociales et puis les objectifs, les ODD. Ce qui fait que donc, il y a eu également un benchmarking avec les codes miniers du Mali et du Niger, qui étaient des pays où l'activité est très en avance, et le code minier du Ghana, le leader donc, en matière de production de l'or. Et donc, on est allé donc, on a pu cadrer un peu mieux l'exploitation des mines à petite échelle, à savoir l'exploitation dite artisanale et celle dite semi-industrielle, à côté de l'exploitation industrielle. Ce qui se passe, c'est qu'il y a un mouvement très rapide d'évolution de l'exploitation des mines à petite échelle, c'est-à-dire artisanale et semi-industrielle, ce qui fait qu'on ne reconnaît même plus de mines artisanales. Tout le monde est passé à l'utilisation des produits chimiques, à la mécanisation, et donc pratiquement la petite échelle revient à une exploitation semi-industrielle ou carrément industrielle en miniature. Donc les rencontres qui se font, également le rôle de notre réseau, donc le réseau partenaire qui est appuyé par l'IRD, financé par l'AFD, et des centres d'excellence qui existent dans les institutions d'enseignement supérieur de la Côte d'Ivoire, du Niger et de la Guinée, c'est de rassembler les acteurs, créer la confiance et permettre à ce qu'on se retrouve pour mettre de l'ordre dans tout ça, non pas de façon, comment dire, autoritaire, mais par la concertation et la création de la confiance entre les différents acteurs. Et ça aboutit donc, comment dire, ça commence à prendre et les administrations, les acteurs miniers et les populations acceptent de se parler et de se rapprocher de la recherche scientifique. Donc on a réussi en Côte d'Ivoire, par exemple, récemment à faire signer un accord cadre de coopération entre le plus grand syndicat des petites mines qui regroupe 400 acteurs, 400 petites entreprises minières et l'Institut national polytechnique de Yamoussoukro à l'effet de réussir un accompagnement scientifique au niveau de la formation et de renforcement des capacités des acteurs et également donc au niveau de la recherche, donc des études d'impact pour lesquelles les petites mines ne sont pas suffisamment outillées. Donc il y a cet accompagnement-là qui est possible, qui existe, et donc pour nous conduire vers une modernisation rapide des petites mines à l'effet d'appliquer maintenant dans un cadre plus moderne, plus strict, voilà, les objectifs donc, de développement durable, réduire donc, l'émission carbone, etc. Donc c'est cette confiance-là qu'on a réussi à établir.
Just one word. I will continue in French in terms of solidarity with my friends. Juste pour dire que par rapport à la question que vous avez posée, on est sur, comme on disait tout à l'heure, sur une trajectoire. C'est une trajectoire qui existe dans tous les pays du monde où il y a de l'activité minière. Tout le côté social, on parle, j'ai entendu, de social acceptance, on ne dit plus social acceptance. On essaie de construire, en fait, puisque, et ça c'est les sciences humaines et sociales qui nous l'ont montré, on ne parle plus de ça puisque ça veut dire qu'on vient après, en fait la population viendrait après les décisions qui sont déjà faites. Donc à travers le programme de Ace Partner, donc, on essaie de construire d'abord un système de recherche beaucoup plus robuste, beaucoup plus performant, multidisciplinaire et interdisciplinaire, ce qui n'est pas la même chose, et adressant des questions sociétales, donc ce qu'on dit transdisciplinaire. Et donc là, à chaque fois, maintenant, on essaie des outils pour construire, alors Ace Partner construit des réseaux entre les centres d'excellence à l'échelle locale, à l'échelle régionale et internationale, de façon à accroître les connaissances et à prendre les connaissances en réseau. On en a parlé ce matin aussi, c'est-à-dire la définition. L'aide à la construction de réseaux qui eux-mêmes après vont pouvoir être indépendants et à partir des forces réelles et des compétences qui existent et qui sont à développer en Afrique de l'Ouest, en réseau avec les autres mondes qui évidemment travaillaient sur l'activité minière, que ce soit en Amérique du Sud, en France, ou l'expérience, ou alors dans d'autres pays. Donc l'idée là par rapport à cette construction-là, c'est par exemple de faire des living labs avec les populations, c'est de faire des ateliers. Il y a des ateliers, donc Ace Partner aide à faire des ateliers avec les populations et également avec les associations et les opérateurs miniers, parce que l'idée, c'est ce qu'a dit Alphonse, c'est de créer des partenariats de confiance. Si on ne crée pas des partenariats de confiance avec les opérateurs miniers, les public stakeholders et puis le monde de la science et la population, on n'arrive à rien en termes de résolution de problèmes. On n'arrivera qu'à des conflits. Même si on a tous évidemment la même vertu en termes d'opérations minières en tête, en termes de fin de la trajectoire, là on est au début. Ils sont au début de la trajectoire et je dirais qu'en France aussi on l'est. Parce qu'on voit aujourd'hui que les projets miniers, ils ne redémarrent pas parce que justement, c'est pas construit avec les populations, difficilement, même s'il y a des enquêtes publiques, mais on le voit. Donc tout le travail reste à faire et c'est ça justement qui est intéressant back and forth, c'est qu'avec ce que l'on est en train de faire, ce qu'il est en train de faire en Afrique de l'Ouest, ça peut effectivement servir donc à d'autres pays qui sont dits développés, qui pour moi ne le sont pas actuellement ou qui ne le deviennent plus. On a un exemple actuellement avec plusieurs pays, je dirais presque d'ailleurs comme la France actuellement pour moi. C'est une opinion personnelle. Donc je pense que, et ça, du coup, on rebondit sur la discussion qu'on a eue tout à l'heure du monde multipolaire et de ce qu'on appelle le développement, qui reste encore à définir. Donc là, par rapport à cette construction par rapport à la population, c'est comme ça qu'il faut le faire avec. C'est vraiment très long à faire. Et en même temps, il faut avoir la confiance des opérateurs privés et des opérateurs publics, ce qui est également très difficile à construire. Et on pense que la recherche peut y aider. Voilà ce que je voulais rajouter. Avec votre aide.
Merci to everyone. I think we're getting late, so unless there's any other very important questions, no. So, okay, I'd like to thank everybody, all our participants, and I'm going to close this session. Thanks to all the presenters, thanks to all our commenters, and we will see you tomorrow.